I realized it's been a number of years since there's been any kind of overview video of the Colombian Western, and a lot has changed since those early days. We have an operating session tonight, so I thought in advance I'd do a kind of GoPro walk-around video and explain some of the things that you might see if you were an operator coming to the layout for the first time. The layout's housed in a two-car garage in our backyard. We had an extension added to it, and that's what you're seeing now. You walk through the French doors into the crew lounge. This is also where the dispatcher is resident. The extension we added is pretty small. To the left through that door is where we store our bikes, but I also have an airbrush set up in there and a half horsepower drill press. We primarily use the room as a playroom for our kids, but it also has a fold-out couch for guests, and that's where the crew gets to sit between their assignments. Let's have a closer look at the dispatches area, cramped as it is. Dispatching was added as an afterthought on the layout, so we use a card table instead of a proper desk. On that table, there are the train order boards, train order forms, stamp pads, the computer that the dispatcher uses to control the train order semaphores and fast clock is set up on a laptop stand. I've recently put in a Wi-Fi router so that we can support Y-throttle. Here we see the train sheets that the dispatcher fills in and the record for the train orders, and the wireless phone that they can use to speak to the operators, speak to the engineers to OS their times. On the door to the layout is the call board, and here is a list of not only all the trains we'll run, but also their relative difficulty. And this is where I put the sign-up lists. Going through the door, we go into the balance of the garage, which is where the layout is located. That's a small 1400 watt air conditioner, which helps to keep the room cool, but actually only removes as much heat as the lights. There are two gates across this area. The lower gate is where the Slocan River scene is located, and the upper one shows Fife and the limestone loader for the limestone that went to Cominco. This is a more significant gate, which includes lighting in the backdrops. Ahead of us we see the mushroom area. We'll see more of that later. Turning to the right, we are going down the main aisleway. And lower on the right we see the Kootenay River scene, and above it is the Lafferty area. Now we're walking towards the main yard at Nelson. We can start to see the snow scene above us, which is Paulson Canyon. In this little alcove here, this is where the Nelson West yard master will switch the classification tracks. There's enough room for them to sit in here out of the way of most of the traffic. Continuing our review of Nelson Yard, we see the classification tracks, the through diesel house in the middle, and the arrival departure tracks, superintendent's house, mock-up thereof on the hillside, the Y for turning power, and the large Kootenay Forest Products sawmill at the east end of Nelson. In the upper deck is Farron Summit, which is 64 inches above the garage floor. Here there's a turning Y for the pusher sets, house track, maintenance away track, and a log reload. As the track moves eastbound, we cross a large fill at Porcupine Creek and enter the western portal of Bulldog Tunnel. Below it, we see a section of the Nelson subdivision crossing 5 Mile Creek. That's Troop Junction. That hole in the backdrop is actually to east staging representing Cranbrook and Creston. This area represents a very narrow valley which empties into the Lower Hour Lake. This is Pup Creek, and you can watch trains sort of snaking along this narrow creek side here. This is actually the middle deck facing outwards of the mushroom. Above and below it are actually inward facing decks which house the Slocan and Caslo sub. Turning the corner, we can see the tanks and train order station at Corkindall, and a large passing siding where large eastbound and westbound freights can meet. There is actually a crossover in the middle of the siding. This crossover is handy when you need to double the hill up from Shields. The lift gate into the interior of the mushroom is up right now, but obviously during operations it would be lowered. We're now looking down the western aisleway. On the right we see the climb to Farron. On the left, at the top, we have Cascade, and below that we have the Craft Mill. This area of the Farron climb is highlighted by the three large bridges. The first one we see is Bar, followed by Far Creek, and in the corner is the McCormick Trestle. The idea here is trying to give the operators the sense that they're completely surrounded by scenery. hence the dead-ended aisleway. The tunnel there is Tunnel 2, McCormick Creek, which I've modeled as a curved bridge, but in the prototype is a straight bridge, and Shields with its water tank and maintenance away siding. This is a small siding, so it's not useful for the large meets, but it's good for the pushers to come down and meet here to push the trains westbound to the summit. The cliffs here are pretty dramatic, only slightly more dramatic than the prototype, but they help to mask the large helix that's behind it. The main line actually enters westbound behind the craft mill, does 2 turns, and then comes out of that tunnel at Shields. What we see here is Cascade, which is the westernmost visible portion of the main line. The mirrors on the ceiling are useful for the operators to watch their trains as they're coming out of western staging. There's 2 tracks there, and the one that's actually directly on the ceiling is useful so that the operators can see how the turnouts for the mid-siding crossover are set. Cascade is the western foot of the Farron Hill, so pushers also meet trains here to push eastbound to Farron. And below it is the Celgar pulp mill, which is switched by the craft switcher job. Continuing along, we see the 5th crossing of the Kettle River, which is crossed by trains eastbound right out of Cascade. Below that, we see the currently under construction Pope and Talbot sawmill and the Y of Castlegar, the Castlegar yard. In the distance, we see the staging, south staging, which represents the Tadnak smelter, which brings us back to where we entered the room. So now I'll show you the second part of the layout, which are the isolated Caslow and Slocan branches inside the mushroom. These branches are reached from South Slocan Junction, which is bridged by a swing gate that swings out from underneath Corkendall. Operators operate inside this mushroom area. On the lower level is the Slocan branch, so trains cross the main aisleway on that swing gate. They swing into the mushroom on the lower level. They go through the hamlet of Valakin, where there's a log reload and a small farm scene. And they continue up the Slocan River, across a piled trestle, and then a more substantive pony truss bridge at Lemon Creek. Leaving Lemon Creek, the Slocan sub terminates at Slocan City, where the large Triangle Pacific sawmill is located. The trackage here is quite prototypical, and it's quite complicated for operators to switch. Also here is the barge slip, where the train is loaded, locomotive and caboose and all, onto a barge for a trip up the Slocan Lake, which here is represented by me lifting the barge up to the end of the lake, which is at Rosebery, shown here. The operators can unload their cars from the barge, pull their train through the hole in the backdrop, which represents New Denver stub staging, and make up their train in the Rosebery yard. The Caslow sub then continues, it climbs past a small township called Hills, and then reaches its summit at Summit Lake, where there's a passing siding that they can use to double the hill at an cusp if necessary. The line then falls from Summit Lake into Nakusp. I've represented trackage both before and after the Lower Arrow Lake was flooded through the creation of the Kingsley Side Dam. In the back we have New Nakusp, which is the trackage that was represented after the lake level was raised, and at the front we have sawmills and pole yards and a station dock, which was the trackage that existed in Nakusp before the lake level was raised. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this unpolished walking tour of the Columbian Western. I hope to get back to producing more polished videos in the future. The layout's been under construction now for 10 years nearly to the day. It's been a lot of fun to build, but I have to admit it's a whole lot more fun to operate. So if operations is an area of the hobby that you're not investigating, I certainly hope you give it a try.